So I'm going to be discussing the impacts of reshoring on the trucking industry. So reshoring is essentially where manufacturing may have been moved or may have taken place outside of the United States or the domestic area that you're in. And then reshoring is where that is brought back into the United States or to the domestic area where the manufacturer operates. And so we're going to discuss how reshoring can affect the trucking industry specifically. So there are some positive impacts and some negative impacts that reshoring could have on the trucking industry. We're going to start with some of the positive things. So one of the positive things is if there's more domestic manufacturing, then there is more demand for trucking, more demand for raw materials, components, and other finished goods. And so there is more of a demand for trucking. If manufacturers build facilities and start doing their production, they're going to need to get their inputs and then also send out their outputs here in the US. So the trucking industry in the US is going to start seeing a lot of that demand begin to increase, which is good. A business wants to be in demand. It's good for their profits. With that, there's also the positive impact that if there's more domestic production, then in a lot of cases, the products that are needing to be shipped and transported are shorter range transportation, if that makes sense. So whereas in the past, the production and manufacturing has been outside of the US, so they've needed more long range shipping options, like maybe using water or things like that to get from other countries into the US. Well, if production's happening in the US, then they can use more short range shipping methods like trucking. And so, because as we've discussed in previous videos, trucking is the best mode typically for short range transportation. And so that would definitely be a good thing for the trucking industry. And then there's also just a steadier demand when, like I said, there's increased demand, but there's also just like a steadier demand when you see that manufacturing is moving into the US. You know that you're going to have businesses that are wanting your transportation services. And so those are all good things for the trucking industry, but there are some potential negative things in the trucking industry that could come from this as well. With increased demand, you have to have increased supply. And so a lot of the trucking companies may not be prepared to handle the demand that would come from increased domestic demand. And so it would take a lot for them to be able to meet that demand, and it could be costly. So with that comes cost pressures like labor costs and fuel costs, and other things that would come along with having to meet that demand that they may not be prepared for as a company. And so those are things that they would have to kind of work out and figure out. And then another thing is labor shortages. So having a shortage of truck drivers, and then not being able to meet what the demand is for transportation. And so that's something that they have to figure out. And then another thing is it would be increased competition possibly. So if there's a lot more domestic demand happening for trucking as a mode of transportation, then you're going to have other companies most likely that want to start out competing for this business. As they see a growing demand, they're going to think, well, I should compete in this because now there's so much more demand that I may be able to get into that market. And so established competitors may have to figure out ways to kind of stay ahead of those rising competitors that would come from that increased demand. And then also just overall, the logistics would really shift. If trucks are, the trucking companies are used to a certain way that they've been kind of getting a flow of things, with things coming in more from the outside, and then like we've talked about in class, the piggybacking or things like that, where it's truck and then it goes to some other mode and then it's truck. Well, if a lot of their logistics kind of transfers to just truck, where they're not doing as much of the front end and back end, but they're doing kind of the whole stretch. That's going to change their logistics, their process for how they operate their supply chain. And so those are things that they would have to consider, some impacts that would possibly affect the trucking industry with the possibility of reshoring.